Maxim, who organized this whole thing, along with all of everybody else who's involved, asked me about doing this about 3 months ago. And I immediately said yes, not having any idea what I would talk about. And, I thought, but I got 3 months, I'll figure something out. And about a day and a half later, Aiden wrote and said, okay, but we need the title to your speech. So I thought, okay, well, I really only have like this moment. So I spit out the title of the speech, this thing about the empty void of doubt and possibility. And I realized that really what I was talking about was coming up with what I was going to talk about. I had no idea, so I was in complete doubt, and I was hoping for infinite possibilities. So, but it got me thinking, and it's funny how starting with that led me to some other thoughts about that very thing. I always find it interesting to hear how it is that people like us, creative people, arrive at the point of creating something. There's like a moment when a bunch of random thoughts sort of come together into some sort of coherent form. All of us have our lifetimes of experiences that have led right up to this moment right now. So, whether it's a musical composition or a sculpture or painting or a script, why is it and how is it that all of that comes together into something first formulated in our minds and then often made tangible in the world? And I think that at least a part of the reason why that we seem somehow driven to bring into being what it is we see inside our own minds is because we're social beings. We like to share things. And even the most seemingly reclusive among us probably has some desire for this second person experience, a way to communicate and share with someone else what I'm seeing inside my mind in a way that hopefully you might understand it. Art is such a great communicator amongst people all around the world, even if we don't speak the same language. In my case, I know that the end product of the creative process, whatever the thing is that I'm working on, is usually, almost all the time, something that is largely unplanned. I have enormous admiration for anyone who works in the arts that can create on demand, on the clock, I almost never can. I guess, my background really is that something pops into my head, usually a visual. And if it actually stays there long enough for me to take a mental snapshot, I create around that template to some degree. It might be a scenario or just a moment within a scenario, or the personification of a character, or could just be some little physical part of a character, like long, slender arms or a furrowed brow, or, a very clean, minimal look to a puppet. But for me, it seems that those little notions come out of this sort of empty causal place filled with no possibilities and yet endless possibilities all at the same time. It's a little bit like being in a huge supermarket trying to find everything you need to put together a recipe, and let's say the lights go out and you're wandering around in the dark, and then you find some eggs and you catch a glimpse of some butter and some flour, and then before you know it, you've got what you need to bake the cake. And the best part for me is once that's all done, you get to add all the icing on top of the cake. That's my favorite part because metaphorically speaking, you get to lick the spoon. And when I look back on my life, somehow I had the true good fortune of ending up with parents that didn't discourage oh, sorry, hang on. You tell your phone no notifications and do not disturb, and then it has that mind of its own. What was I saying? Oh yeah, I had these great parents who didn't discourage what was really for me an extension of like childhood play as I was going into my early adolescent time. I was 10 years old when I chose the work that I've done for several decades now. And somehow both my parents found ways to support my passion in a way I find a little bit surprising too, because, they were fairly traditional Southern parents, and they grew up just after the Great Depression in the US. And so security was a real important thing. And the arts might have looked a little bit frivolous in a way, this creative pursuit, but there was almost no attempt ever to dissuade me from doing this thing that I just couldn't not do. I had to do this. And even though some of my work has turned to pre-production elements in the last 20 years or so. Most of it has been as a performer, with the pre-production side of it being done really mostly to allow for the performance to be at its best. The performance was the end product. And even though there's significant prep, you know, you do a lot of work just in order to deliver a performance rather than planning during the majority of those years. I've been mostly just kind of prepping for this role or scene, setting the stage so that I could be as spontaneous as possible once I was actually doing the primary work itself, you know, the actual performance. And I've come to realize in more recent years that creation, at least for me, is always a spontaneous thing. It seems that this sort of improvisational creation, as I've sort of come to call it, is at the core of everything I do. But oddly, at the same time, the traditional definition of doing improv, you know, like improvisational theater, was something I've always avoided. Some of you might remember this game show called Hollywood Squares. It's had a lot of incarnations over the years in this country. And of course, it was called by other names in other parts of the world because, you know, Hollywood is a different place than the UK. I think it was Celebrity Squares there, but it was all over the world. And I was on that show a bunch of times as Kermit the Frog. You know, I was curled down beneath this desk, all curled up with my arm in the air for hours, because, you know, you never knew when the director was going to cut to your square during the live show, even if you weren't talking, for a random reaction. So Kermit had to be alive throughout the whole thing, whether he was speaking or not. So my arm was in the air for like half an hour straight, which is really tiring. Anyhow, the idea of the show was that the host would ask the celebrity guests a question. The contestant had to decide whether the answer that they gave was true or false. And even most of the celebrities who weren't comedians would, you know, most of the time respond first with kind of a punchline answer, something silly, a funny joke, before answering with the actual answer they were going to give. But, you know, whether it was actually the real answer or a bluff. So I'd go backstage, you know, we do 5 shows a day. I'd go backstage and we'd have lunch and I'd sit around the table with all these big time kind of really professional comedians. And they would say things like, you know, did you come up with that answer in the moment? It was really hilarious. Or have you even considered doing something like stand-up? Or do you have a background in improv? And while I did come up with a lot of those answers spontaneously, I would have never considered doing stand-up comedy. It terrified me. And I had no real background in improv, no formal kind of training. And I would find myself kind of doubting, you know, this great validation that I was receiving from these big time comedians and pros and actors when they were basically saying that I was doing something right, you know. And I would say even after 20 years into my adult career, after already performing lead characters, you know, for big major films and television series, I would find myself kind of terrified at the notion of picking up an anonymous puppet and trying to immediately improvise a character alongside other puppeteers that I knew quite well. I would watch another television show called Whose Line Is It Anyway? And I would marvel at how incredible those actors are at being given a scenario that theoretically they didn't know in advance, and spontaneously performing a skit with each other that was funnier than, you know, 90% of anything that was actually written for television. But there came a time when I realized that what I seemed to be good at was something a little bit different. This sort of endless improvisation with a character that I had developed beforehand. You know, I found the problems associated with having a strong character. And, you know, I would come up with this personality that I could comfortably inhabit that was fully formed to a point where the character functioned like any living, breathing, sentient being that we might communicate with. In that circumstance, while performing an established character, it became an extension of myself. And the improvisational work was, and is, still by far my favorite thing to do. You know, it's what I'm doing now with this cave-in live stream that I do every month. For me, character is always more vital and important than funny. And if there is truthfulness in the character, funny usually happens because the character is true to themselves and they're kind of interesting, hopefully interesting to be around. So anyway, I said all of that just to say that it seems that creating something out of our minds is, in many cases, an uncertain effort filled with finding problems spontaneously all the way along the way. And I'm kind of fascinated with this idea of finding problems. Oftentimes, there's a process of elimination that goes on behind the scenes for someone who's creating something, this kind of time of trial and error, while we subjectively sort out what we decide works and doesn't work. And it turns out people who study creativity sometimes call it finding problems, problem finding, as opposed to problem solving. And you look a little further and there's research, like there is on everything, to suggest that problem finders who take that extra step to break out of the box and discover unforeseen impediments in creating something are actually more likely to stick with a creative career of some sort in their lives. And so, I got a little bit obsessed with this little notion, and I stumbled across a study where a number of art students were asked to choose from a bunch of objects to use for a still life sketch. So they had all these objects on a table. And it turns out that they went about it in two pretty distinctly different ways. Many of them wasted no time choosing just a couple of objects, and they quickly planned the end product, this sketch that they were going to do, and started drawing right away, while others worked much more slowly. They gave themselves more options in choosing the objects, so they took more things to work with, thought longer about the sketch, and ended up taking more time to finish it. So there was a deadline in this particular thing that they were doing. The conclusion was that the first group was solving problems of how to do the best sketch, and the second group was finding problems along the path of creation rather than actually focusing on the end result, the end product, that sketch. So, some folks argue that the product is not the art. It's the act of creating that is the art. And I think I see that to some degree. And I see that really creating something original from scratch, it isn't quite the same as plotting a course to produce an end product. Let's say you and I are having a conversation and you say something, my response is spontaneous. I think it's likely that spontaneous thoughts are being filtered through all that we've experienced before, the culmination of our, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I love that song. What was I saying? Oh, that our thoughts are spontaneous. It's like a whole lifetime of gathered knowledge, experience, and formed opinions that are being applied to the present subject matter in the particular moment. But the conversation seemingly comes out of nowhere, and I think that more often than not, we very likely don't even know what we're going to say next until we open our mouth to say it. So that says to me that in our daily lives, all of us have conversations, and those conversations are improvised. And I noticed that the act of creating, particularly the creation of works of art out of our own minds, sort of follows a similar pattern. One idea brings forth the next, and so on and so on. In my own case, as a teenager, once I found myself really attracted to the work that Jim Henson and his team were doing with the Muppets in the 1960s and 70s, I originally found myself, putting on a puppet and spewing forth whatever came into my head. And also my circumstances forced me to do what is essentially improvising all the other aspects necessary to eventually do a puppet performance, For instance, I had to learn to build these physical puppets themselves, the necessary tools needed to bring the product of the creative endeavor into existence. I had to organize ways that I would have the opportunity to perform in those years at school or at churches or children's daycare centers or birthday parties, all that kind of stuff, And all of that eventually led to this small local television show here in Atlanta. And all of that allowed for this improvised performance of a character, which was kind of the end product. these days, after all these years of doing this strange, weird thing that I do, I realize that I have, if I have a style of creation, it is almost completely improvisational. And by that, I mean, whether I need a piece of music or 3 pages of dialogue or, a new character or a prop or a costume, or even if I'm in the midst of a live performance, I work in this odd combination that I would call probably something like disciplined chaos. And I improvise all of those aspects of doing the thing. And even though I don't necessarily know what will come next in any of those areas, I seem to work productively in that slightly chaotic state of mind. It can be very stressful at times, especially if a deadline exists. So I just, I try to avoid those deadlines by not letting them sneak up on me by surprise. Applying the brakes well in advance of going over the cliff. Maybe that's the discipline part. I don't know. But otherwise, I've fallen into a real practice of trying to get into a mindset so that I can simply listen to and listen for what comes next, just allowing answers to emerge from wherever it is they emerge from. It comes down to what feels right to do or to add one moment at a time. So for whatever it's worth, that turns out to be a big part of how I end up doing why I do what I do, but it's not why I do it. I talk a lot about Jim Henson because I made him a major part of my life at a really early formative stage for me. Jim was doing work that was groundbreaking at the time, but he wasn't particularly proprietary when it came to keeping how he did things a secret. He would go on talk shows. And the point was that, he and his little group were going to do a sketch done with puppets. But Jim would sometimes actually show the audience behind the puppet stage, behind the scenes, how he was going to do what you were about to see, before the actual sketch. And it was as though he loved sharing all the problems that had to be solved along the way in order for it to be possible to now do this really seemingly simple little Muppet puppet bit. So once again, in my pre-teenage years, I wrote this letter to Jim Henson and asking him if he had written any books on how to build puppets, because I kind of realized the first thing I'm going to do if I'm going to get into this is I got to make puppets, and I had no idea how to do that. And a few months later, I got a reply. I got a letter from Jim to this 10-year-old Steve, encouraging me to keep it up and directing me to these very simple little Muppet puppet patterns he had published in a magazine a few years before. Again, with almost no concern on his part over giving away, what could be called proprietary trade secrets, the patterns to the simple Muppets. And I, of course, immediately got these patterns and, adjusted them and added an inch here and took a tuck there and learned about making shapes out of fabric and foam and expanded those patterns into some of my own characters. But the real point of that is, in this funny sort of way, Jim Henson chose to collaborate with a 10-year-old kid living in the rural South who he had never met, in very much the same way that he would then collaborate with me years later after he hired me. And of course, he didn't have to do that. He didn't have to do that at all. He could have sent me like a little kid patronizing letter and I would have kept fiddling with puppets,
Excuse me for interjecting. I just wanted to give a heads up that we have about 4 minutes left.
Oh my God, I got to race. I'll go fast. Okay, boy, this goes in a hurry, doesn't it? And when I think about that, I think it validated why my interest in the Muppets became what it was, because I seem to have this sort of inborn, inherent need for camaraderie. And it's something I'm addicted to. I love the camaraderie of working with a group of trusted people. And it sometimes gets me in trouble because I tend to create that camaraderie with people who might not have the commitment to it that I do. Different talk someday. But I think that when 2 or more of us gather in the name of creating this thing that we want to create, we seem to increase our ability. Real quick, I think we also have the ability to reach inside the separate parts of ourself and find a sort of subtle other side to our capital S self that we can also be in communion with when we're creating alone. And I think that could lead to a sort of cascade effect that comes out, one creative idea at a time and one begets the next. I don't know. As always, I have no true answers about this stuff. I can only share what seems to work for me, but I guess I want to thank you all for listening to me ramble about hows and whys. And my hope is that what Maxim has planted the seed for here, along with all of his team, can net a community of people who might find ways and means to collaborate together on some creative ventures that can all serve each other. So thank you, guys. Did I make it? I don't know.
Right on time. Right on time.
I'm so sorry we don't have any time for questions, I guess. We'll figure that out another way.
Well, we have 2 minutes. So if we have a quick question.
Let's do it.
Someone asked, what makes performing puppets like the Muppets so artistic and why? So if we can, I think we could do this in 2 minutes.
I will certainly try. What makes performing them artistic? Well, anything artistic to me is, no matter what your career is and what you do in life, as I was kind of alluding to, you create all the time. In your daily life, you create so many things and scenarios and conversations and interactions. And the Muppets, because of their longevity, have always been about that. They've been about being a character that stays consistent, and you can relate to that character, and therefore they are trustworthy. They are truthful. Even if they're not telling the truth, you believe that they are truthful in what they're trying to tell you. So you make a connection. And as long as that connection lasts, and it waxes and wanes, it can go away. But I think that makes them have this connection and certainly renders them, a work of art. Oh, stop.
Thank you, Saki the Sock Puppet and Alejandro Rivera for the question. And thank you everyone for attending. Just a reminder that you'll be able to watch this recording back. The link will appear in the schedule. So thank you everyone. This was really fun. And thank you, Steve, again.
Thank you all. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks to all the mobsters. See you guys.